Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Please don't forget to follow Urbanistica on the different social media platforms, and also let's connect on LinkedIn. Big thanks to Urbanistica podcast partner, Mehaffy. Mehaffy is an international engineering and design company providing sustainable solutions in the fields of energy, industry, and infrastructure. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. Today we have one more new great story in collaboration with KTH, the Center for the Future of Places. I have the pleasure to welcome my guest, Michael Mehaffy, to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome.
Thank you.
How are you doing, Michael?
I'm good. As we were just discussing, I've been traveling from the United States. I've had two Moderna vaccines now, and I have a periodic appointment here at the university, and I'm here about a third of the year or so, and I'm actually working on public space and a number of related issues and the impact of COVID-19. Of course, we're all thinking about that.
So how was Stockholm? Now it's very snowy.
Yeah, at the moment, the snow is just melting. We had a kind of mini blizzard last night, actually, but I don't mind it. I like this saying that there's no bad weather, only bad clothing.
So you just reverse engineer the mindset.
Right.
So, Michael, let's start with you. You are our storyteller for this episode. So how would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your passion?
Well, just a brief bio, if you will. I'm a researcher, educator, author, and practitioner in planning and design, urban design, and sometimes building design and garden design, other kinds of design as well. And that's probably, I wear different hats, I'll put it that way.
Yeah. And tell us more about your journey. Where did you grow up and what do you study?
Well, my interest originally when I started in my college career was in music, and I was very passionate about that. And I went to a place called California Institute of the Arts, which luckily for me was an interdisciplinary school. So I not only studied music, I studied design, art, and drama, film, many different disciplines, and also anthropology and sociology and philosophy. And I got more and more passionate about these other subjects, and especially about what I was seeing at that time was the sort of looming environmental disaster in the early 1970s that especially in our built environment, I began to be very disturbed because this was Southern California. There was a very sprawling sort of landscape, and I could see that happening right in front of my eyes. And I became very concerned about it. And it wasn't really until later that I sort of had an aha moment and I said, what I need to do is go into architecture, because it was sort of a winding road of going into, I knew that music was going to be a very, very difficult career to make a living in. And maybe it wasn't the most valuable contribution I could make, even though I loved it and I still love it. But I ended up through a sort of long process of self-discovery of finding myself loving architecture, frozen music, if you will, and urbanism, because I felt that that really could apply to the challenges of our time, the way we build settlements that seem to be so dysfunctional in many ways, and the environmental problems that were related to that I could see. So to make a long story short, I ended up studying architecture, first as an undergraduate, then as a graduate at UC Berkeley. I went and studied with this fascinating character by the name of Christopher Alexander, and became a collaborated with him and a lifelong friend of his. And that was a big part of my influence. But so really looking back, I realized that music was a big influence on me. But also, I remember when I was a little kid, when I was 4 years old, actually, my parents took me on a vacation to Mexico. And I remembered that environment, that sort of beautiful, natural and human-centered environment. And there was something about it that really profoundly struck me. I realize now, looking back, I think I became a little urbanist in that because I realized that it was affecting the way we were experiencing our world and each other and the way we were interacting and the quality of the day, so to speak. Henry David Thoreau had this great line about the greatest art is to shape the quality of the day. And that has, I look back now and I realize that, that really did shape what I later came to be as an urbanist and as a designer and as a person who, was concerned about all these things. And certainly Christopher Alexander's thinking kind of fit right into that, the emphasis on the sort of human factors and the natural environment and sustainability and so on. But also some of the sort of new understanding that we're getting now from the sciences about human beings as complex systems of perception and experience, and our psychology and our neurology and our evolutionary history, all these factors that we now understand are so complex and so rich. And we see now that we're immersed in this world of complex adaptive systems and networks, and cities are exactly that. Cities are these socio-spatial reactors where we form these networks of connection and interaction and creativity and all the great things that we can do in cities. And it has to do with the way the spaces are structured and the way we interact with each other. And so that was a really, really profound impact on me. And I think it's been a profound impact on a lot of people coming out of the last 50 years or so. Jane Jacobs had this wonderful last chapter in her great book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, about the kind of problem a city is, and that it's really a problem in organized complexity, as she put it. And that was a huge impact on me, that along with Chris Alexander and a number of other people, Kevin Lynch and other people that your listeners might be familiar with. All of those things sort of went into the mix for me and the way I sort of formed my understanding of the kind of world that we're in, and sometimes it's different from what we assume in our sort of ordinary daily concepts of design. And so that's always been an interesting thing to me. How can we enrich our understanding with these new insights from the sciences about complex adaptive systems and self-organization and networks and so on? And I think the answer to that is we can enrich our understanding enormously. We can enrich our practice enormously. So anyway, sorry for a long. You asked me for my life story, and I guess I gave it.
I think this is very beautiful story that you told, and the journey since you were a kid and a little urbanist until you grow up, and now also writing many books. But before we talk about your new book, I would love to hear more the story of how did you come in contact with the Center for the Future of Places? You're in the US, the center is here. So what is the background?
Right. So after I studied with Chris Alexander and I began my own practice and doing essentially design build, mostly at the residential scale at that point. And gradually one opportunity led to another, and I ended up doing more urban scale projects. I did a big mixed use project. I was the project manager for a project called Orenco Station, which was like 1,800 houses. So long story getting to that point, but I really very fortunately was able to practice at large urban scale, doing, in many different parts of that, including just right down to the detailed design elements, as well as the management and the strategy and the policy and all those parts of it. And then I was hired to do a new education program for continuing professionals about, okay, well, how do you do this stuff? How do you implement it? What are the strategies? And this was actually in London in 2003, working with the Deputy Prime Minister's office and with the Royal Institute of British Architects and the Prince's Foundation and a number of partners to develop this new education program. And that program, by the way, ended up evolving into a new master's in sustainable urbanism at Oxford. I'm very proud to have played a role in getting that off the ground. But in the meantime, I met this guy named Peter Elmlund, this Swedish guy who worked for the Axel Johnson Foundation. And he at that time was interested in this thing called new urbanism, which we can talk about a little more later. I know you're interested in discussing that. And he and I began a friendship at that time and a collaboration on a number of different projects. The Council for European Urbanism was created around that time, and I was involved in that and organizing some conferences and doing some other things. And over the years, we became more and more involved in collaborating on things. And then Peter started a conference series in 2013 with UN Habitat and with the Project for Public Spaces in New York called the Future of Places conference series. And it was a lead up to the New Urban Agenda, to the Habitat 3 conference in 2016. And I was brought in, at that point, I was actually lecturing to some of the students here at KTH, and Peter said, oh, come on over to the conference, do it. We'll get you involved in that, and you can do video interviews and some other chores. So to make, again, a long story shorter, I began to work more directly with Axel Johnson Foundation and eventually with KTH, and I got an appointment here at KTH. Coming out of the Habitat 3 conference, the UN conference, which we can also talk about in a little more detail because I think it's a very significant milestone in our profession. But coming out of that, we set up a center here at the university called the Center for the Future of Places. And it was really just to sort of take forward this conference series into a center that would actually do research and publication and conferences and events. And we have a collaboration with UN Habitat that's ongoing. And it's more focused on, okay, we've got the new urban agenda, but how do we implement it? What does the research say? How do you translate the research into practice? And that's a very important challenge, of course, right now. So that's how I got involved with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest or one of the biggest challenge, that how to make the research more on the practical, on the field, and make it work.
Absolutely, and I've been a big sort of evangelist for that for a long time, because I think the research, it's easy for us all to get stuck in our silos, right? In the research, in the ivory towers. I can say that from part of that community, and then also the practitioners and getting isolated from the research and thinking that those researchers are just a bunch of eggheads who are not really doing anything relevant. And so I've had a foot in both camps for a long time, and that's a advantage for me, I guess, because I see how these things are relevant to each other, so relevant, and not only from the research into the practice, but back again, the feedback cycles, so that the research studies, the post-occupancy evaluations or the field research or whatever it is, and draws conclusions from that then can translate into new practices, new tools and strategies that become more effective, but maybe not totally effective. And then that becomes the subject of additional research and so on. So you get a virtuous cycle.
Exactly. But Michael, why do you think that this gap is still existing?
Well, it's inherent in any human institution that we get siloed, right? And it's always a challenge to bridge the silos and to reconnect. But I also think there are also some historical trends maybe in our in our professions, plural, that are not particularly healthy. You know, the way architecture has become a sort of specialty, an over-specialized. Um, some have called it an art supply, you know, that it just, oh, just be quiet and you make your wild theories. We don't really care about those. Just make some really extravagant packaging on these buildings and then we can sell them. And, you know, the commodification of the design professions and all that. So there's a number of related factors, I think.
Yeah, I understand. So tell me about your new book, Exploring a New Urbanism. I would love also, I love the way you tell stories. I would love to hear also the background for this book, why you decided to write just this specific book. What is the aim of it?
Right. Well, so along the way, I came across this group in the United States that many of your listeners probably know about called the Congress for the New Urbanism. But there's also other allied organizations and other organizations with similar aims. I think, again, going back to Jane Jacobs and the idea that, you know, we want mixed use, we want diversity, we want walkability, we want multimodal transportation, all these kind of ideas, which are actually very different from, for example, the CIM, you know, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, if you all remember from the 1930s, that was all about functional segregation and about, you know, rationalizing design and creating a, you know, the city as a machine and dominated by machines, particularly automobiles and so on. And, you know, that was an important advancement for the time, but it was also very faithful in some ways in terms of what Jane Jacobs famously criticized, the sort of decontaminated sortings, as she put it, pulling the different parts of the city apart in an effort to rationalize them, which again failed to understand the sort of organic qualities or the organized complexity that is underlying all this seeming disorder, the order under the seeming disorder of the city. And so I think the new urbanists were inspired by that and were trying to, in a sense, recapitulate the CM. I mean, I know they said that this is exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to, in essence, sort of turn the CM on its head, but create a similar organization and say, well, let's revisit a lot of these questions. Was it really right of our profession to think that this segregation of functions was such a good idea, or that you know, the moving buildings away from streets and just leaving streets for vehicles and not for pedestrians, and you know, it's a place for everything and everything in its place, which, you know, it goes back further than the CM actually, but it certainly was, that was a seminal moment of in the profession. And so the new urbanists were essentially saying, we want to move forward in a new direction and question and reverse some of these ideas that, no, it is about walkability. It's not just about, you know, vehicular mobility, and it's about mixing of uses and diversity and all of these other related ideas. So that's really what's at the heart of the charter of the new urbanism, which is very similar to the Athens Charter in that sense of which is the CM doctrine, but reversing many of those ideas. And so the new urbanists have had some successes. Certainly, they've become fairly influential internationally. And I'll stress again that you've got to distinguish between that particular group and all of the other sort of allied groups and thinkers and people like Jacobs and people like, you know, I mentioned the Council for European Urbanism and actually the New Urban Agenda, which I recently published a paper on the comparison between the charter of the New Urbanism and the New Urban Agenda, and on a point-for-point basis on many of these points that I just mentioned, walkable, mixed use, multimodal, and so on. There are correspondences, there are very strong correspondences. So when you say, well, new urbanism, isn't that about those guys in you know, in the United States building little neo-trad tract? Well, there are many different people doing many different things that are variously labeled new urbanism, and I think it's very important to be clear exactly what you're talking about. And sometimes the critiques are not at all clear. And so actually what Peter Umland did back in early 2000s, around the time when I met him, is he said, I would like to look at this. I would like to explore this idea of new urbanism. And he really began almost a 2-decade process of conferences and seminars and publications and looking at and sometimes critiquing, certainly that's part of the mix as well. Um, the various strains of what can be called new urbanism in the United States and globally, because it is now really a global phenomenon in different forms. So the idea for the book, coming back to your question, long-winded answer, I know, but is that it's recounting that process and some of the things that have been discussed by some of the authors who were brought to Stockholm and interviewed and part of seminars and so on, some of the people who were key founders of the Congress for the New Urbanism, as well as some practitioners and some other thinkers who have influenced them, including Jane Jacobs and others. And so I think the book, the title is Exploring a New Urbanism. And that's an important point because, again, it's not just this group of people from the United States. It's what are the deeper ideas that they and others are talking about and are urging that we adopt as a profession in place of the ideas that came before. So again, should we have segregated uses or should we have mixed uses? Should we have vehicular mobility as the major transportation mode, or should we also have walkability and maybe walkability as the major mode? Should we have diversity of activities and diversity of people and diversity of, all these kinds of things? And I won't go through the whole charter, but those are some of the major ideas that are, again, very different from the SIAM and the Athens Charter, and the idea that the city is made up of people and people interacting in space, as opposed to made up of buildings and infrastructure and and that Peter likes to talk about the shift from objects to places, and I think that's an important idea. The shift from the structure of the buildings and the environments to the structure of the people and the ways that the buildings and environments either facilitate or don't facilitate the creative connections and interactions between the people. Again, going back to this sort of complex adaptive view of cities. So that's really what the book is about. And it's in a sense a report on what Peter and what our colleagues here at the center and the other people who've been involved have found over the last two decades almost.
But Michael, I know you like from the title, it's written "Exploring a New Urbanism." But are you criticizing or no? Just reviewing and telling, okay, this is good, this is bad. How is the tone of?
Well, I would say that we have not focused as much on the criticism because then there's one really important reason for that. So much of the criticism has been unclear about what exactly it is criticizing. They sort of use a straw man or a boogeyman, so to speak, of those new urbanists. They're all, and then you can fill in the blank. They're all a bunch of neoliberal blah blah blah, or no, they're all a bunch of left-wing radicals who are or they're all a bunch of and you just sort of fill in the blanks. And again, this is the problem with lacking rigor, lacking precision in our analysis and in our research. We've got to start with clarity of understanding of what we're talking about. So we really focus more on that, on, okay, what exactly are we talking about? And then, yes, absolutely, there are things to critique. And I myself have been critical of a number of aspects of, the practitioners of the Congress for the New Urbanism, although I'm a friend and an erstwhile member, I consider myself part of that movement in many ways. But I think there's plenty of criticism from within and from without that's perfectly valid. It's just that it's got to start from a position of clarity and of rigor of understanding what exactly we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And Michael, when we open the book, what will we see? Like, are you having like some diagrams, pictures? How many pages are the book?
Well, so actually, I have a copy here, and it's organized into 4 major sections. And the major sections are founders, which discusses their essays written by the people who are the founders of the Congress for the New Urbanism in this case. And then theories, which discusses some of the underlying ideas, and there are people like Emily Tallon, Doug Kelbaugh, and our colleague here, Tigran, and myself as well, actually. And then thought leaders, people who have really been sort of in the background of the thinking about this. And I mentioned Jane Jacobs, I mentioned Christopher Alexander, Fred Kent at the Project for Public Spaces, Jan Gale, many of your listeners will know of their work, Gale Associates as well, Life Between Buildings and so on and so forth. And then the 4th section is called Frontiers, which is sort of what are the issues right now that we're confronting. And one of those I'll just mention as well is a database project that we're doing here on public space, which is part of the effort at implementation for the New Urban Agenda. How do we identify the literature that's already been done, the research that's already been done on public space, and how that can be applied to implementing the New Urban Agenda, to carrying forward some of these reforms that I think most people actually agree on, whether they call it New Urbanism or not. And that doesn't really matter, actually. It's just a one vehicle perhaps for advancing these ideas and getting them into debate. And then if other people say, oh, no, we don't do New Urbanism, we do mixed use and walkability and multi-, but not New Urbanism. Okay, fine. If you want it that way, it doesn't really matter. A rose is a rose, right? So.
And is it true that new urbanism is only in the US, or we can see it like in Europe and other parts of this world?
Well, again, it depends on what you're talking about. I think the Congress for the New Urbanism is mostly active in the US, but for example, the journal Urban Planning, which is based in Portugal, just did a special issue on new urbanism from what's it called? I think I'm trying to remember the exact name. New urbanism from exception to global norm. So the thesis of it is that in many ways, whether you call it new urbanism or not, and again, that doesn't really matter, the broader movement called new urbanism or a new urbanism has succeeded in advancing acceptance of many of the basic ideas that I think most of us now share. We want cities to be walkable. We want to have mixed use. We want to have multimodal transportation. We want to have, all these other things, diversity of uses, diversity of activities, diversity of people. The idea that cities are, socio-spatial reactors where people mix and create and so on and so forth. So whether you call it that or not, I think it certainly is a global phenomenon. And again, I mentioned the correlation with the New Urban Agenda, and the New Urban Agenda is very much about a lot of the same ideas of cities as walkable, mixed, diverse, complex places that are very different from the sort of neatly organized, segregated, machine-like systems that we were trying to do in the early 20th century.
Very interesting. I would love now to know, what is your reflection about 1-minute city, 15-minute city? What do you think?
Well, there are a lot of different schools of thought and movement, sub-movements or movements, federated movements, however you want to think of them. And the 1-minute city, the 15-minute city, the smart city, smart growth. all of these things are in one way or another related. The idea that we need to recognize how important cities are and how important public spaces are in particular as a sort of um, platform, if you will, on which all of our interactions occur, and that we are in a historical era right now that's very challenging. The rapid urbanization, as I think all of your listeners know, that's historically unprecedented, the rate of urbanization, and yet at the same time, the decline of public space in both quantity and quality is very alarming, because it's in the public spaces that we get that interaction, especially the sort of low carbon interaction, low resource interaction. We can supplement it to some degree with, automobiles and electronic data connections and all the rest of it. But there are two problems with that. One is that it's very resource intensive and it doesn't appear to be sustainable, especially as we increase more and more our consumption of resources. And the other thing is that the quality of it is not really that great. One of the big values of cities is not simply in meeting the people that we already know, but in meeting new people and new ideas and new opportunities and the sort of serendipity and the propinquity, if you will, of that happens in public space, and that turns out to be enormously important for what it is that cities give us, and why cities are so important. So I think right now in this moment, it's this historical moment, it's incredibly important that we recognize the importance of public space and the importance of this sort of network of spaces that begins with public space, but also includes private and semi-private and all the other, other parts of space. And that's actually been a focus of my own work on how these different places form what I've referred to as a place network, a complex, self-organizing, complex adaptive system that is really fascinating if you look at it and you study the way all these different spaces work, because they have the formal aspects that we all recognize, and then they have these very sort of informal and tacit and constantly changing and boundaries and layers and expectations and rules and the ways that people interact, the ways that people connect, but also protect themselves from danger and from other people that might be disruptive and so on. So it's a fascinating subject, and it's more than I can talk about it right now, but it's I think it's really an important dimension of all that we value in cities and that we need to recognize and build on as we're implementing the new urban agenda and as we're creating not only more livable cities but more sustainable cities, because that really is the ballgame right now. That is the challenge that we all face.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many new how to say methods or mindset or movement within so many ism. Why all of them? I mean, why we keep creating new isms? Can't we have just one that will solve the problem of our cities? Or why we keep reinventing things or coming with new things?
Right. Well, I mean, I was talking about the complex adaptive systems and the self-organization and all that, and I think that happens in the professional world too, and in the social world, and so I don't mind. In fact, I think it's inevitable and valuable that we have all these sort of different schools and movements and ideas bubbling up and coalescing in some cases, or competing in some cases, and new things are emerging from that. And I think that's part of the sort of evolutionary process that is so exciting and so productive. So yeah, I think the smart cities, for example, I have some concern. I know there's been a lot of criticism of that it's just a sort of high-tech marketing scheme. On the other hand, we do have to deal with the world of big data. It's here, and it has some opportunities for us when we're thinking about how to map, how to measure, how to understand what's going on in a city and how we can interact and so on. And similarly, the ideas of things like the 15-minute city or the 1-minute city or the smart growth model or the whatever these other models might be. I think they're all trying to advance propositions that are important to consider. There's a danger, of course, of one size fits all or simplistic solutions or too formulaic approaches, and I think we've all got to guard against that, and that's a fair criticism of the new urbanists from that manner. But I think all of these things are important to look at. And I think the other point is if we look at the city as a complex adaptive system that's evolutionary, that's evolving and it's generating new patterns and new information, then it follows, if we really think this through, that stretches back in time, way before 1920, that it's this vast treasury of patterns and information and precedent that are a rich sort of repository for us to mine now of good solutions to human problems. They're the same problems humans have always had of how do you live well together in large groups of people in cities and in towns, how do you create spaces that allow you to be comfortable even though you're with all these other people, public spaces, private spaces, and so on. And so this idea that, again, I talked about the SEUM and we can look back at them and say, well, they didn't know what they didn't know. And that was the historic era that, made sense at the time. But one of the fatal things that I think they had, the idea that they had was Walter Gropius famously said, we're going to start from zero. We're going to cut everything off that's happened before, and we're just going to reinvent ourselves as, sort of new rational machines from the ground up. And I think if you look at it from the point of view of organized complexity or complex adaptive systems or any of these sort of newer ways of looking at complex systems, that is a very naive idea, to say the least. It's essentially lobotomizing. From an evolutionary point of view, it would be like, well, we got to start with bacteria or something. We can't have multicellular organisms because that's old-fashioned. We want to start the world from scratch. So I think that is an important idea and a radical idea, to be sure, that it's not so much, well, if you like this style that happens to be old-fashioned, then you must be old-fashioned. No, it's simply a matter of what are the evolutionary patterns and solutions in the solution space that are evolving that can be recapitulated in some form. And I like to use the example of the dolphin who evolved a dorsal fin that's almost exactly identical to the shark's dorsal fin. And the dolphin didn't say, no, I can't do that. That's 150 million years old. No. We would be old-fashioned if we did that. No, the dolphin simply says, what is the best solution in my solution space? And it happens to be very similar solution space to the sharks, right? The complex turbidity and the laminar flow and all the things that are going on as you move through water and as you deal with that. So I think that's a different way of looking at the way we evolve patterns and the way we regard the potential treasury that we can draw from, not to put quotes on a style from some era and say, look at us, we're just like people in 1820 or something. But to say, no, this is a new era and it's going to be totally different in unique ways, but maybe not totally different in other ways. The sun is still going to come up in the morning, and we're still going to move on two legs at about pretty constant speed, just like we've done.
Maybe we're going to fly, maybe not moving on two legs.
Well, no, and that's that. I mean, I think clearly we've added a whole lot to our evolutionary capacities as animals. But we've also not taken much away, thankfully. And, the idea that we didn't need to walk anymore was not really such a good idea as it looks now, when we recognize the health benefits of walking, for example, and so forth. And the social benefits of interacting with people in a in a space where it's not just a sort of swoopy landscape that's stretched way out and you hardly ever encounter other people, but actually an intimate space, a complex space with lots of edges and densities and zones of encounter and so on and so forth. I think all those things are very interesting.
Yeah, very, very interesting reflection, Michael. And so where can we order your book to explore a new urbanism?
Well, so that book is just now coming out, and we haven't actually put it up online. But if folks want to follow, say on Twitter at Future of Places, then we will tweet out that information. And then we have a number of other books here at the center that I would encourage folks to check out if they're interested. We have a new pattern language book. They may know about the original book, A Pattern Language, and we wrote a new pattern language with our friends at UN Habitat that covers 80 new patterns dealing with the new urban agenda and new topics and new challenges. We also created a companion wiki for that. And you can find that just by going on npl.wiki, npl.wiki. And that's the wiki companion version. And then the pattern language, I can give you a link. Maybe you can put on their podcast site, something like that. And if folks are interested in that as well. So, and those are two of a number of different publications and projects and things that we've been doing. So we've been busy, even in spite of
I understand. And I'm really happy to have you on the podcast, and I'm thankful that you give your time to record this episode. And now I would love that we finish this episode by you giving us, the listeners, 3 takeaway messages and also 1 question.
Okay, sure. Well, so I was talking about public space, and I really think that public space is the essence of cities as complex adaptive systems, as socio-spatial reactors, as I refer to them. It's the platform on which all the other stuff happens. And it's the chance to create weak ties, not just strong ties, people we already know, but people we don't know, ideas we haven't thought about, and so on. And then the second one is that I think we have an enormous challenge on our hands. I think everybody knows it, to create a more sustainable civilization, more sustainable technologies and ways of settling and ways of interacting, cities and buildings and so on. We all recognize that. And I think the way we build cities and buildings is going to be of the essence of that challenge. And then just talking about new urbanism, I don't think, again, that it matters whether we talk about new urbanism per se. It's just really recovering urbanism. You could say restored urbanism, if you will, after a period of what we could consider anti-urbanism, the decline of public space. And then you said 1 question you wanted me to ask the listeners?
Yes, please.
Yeah, glad to. So I teach a course right now called Sustainable Urbanism. And one of the things we have is, interestingly, is we have Jane Jacobs' book, Death and Life, as a sort of core textbook. And it's really interesting how it's now been, 60 years since that book was published, and yet it's still very, very relevant, and unfortunately relevant in some ways, because we haven't made as much progress as we need to. But what I ask at the end is, we talk about the new urban agenda and how it relates to Jacobs and it relates to the new urbanism and so on and so forth. But I ask, how do you think you might be involved in this transition that we're all going to have to make, and specifically in implementing the new urban agenda, and in thinking about how we're going to build different kinds of cities that allow us to have different ways of consuming resources and interacting with each other and moving around in a way that's better quality, that's more livable, that's more enjoyable, because I think that has a direct relationship to whether it's more sustainable. It's not going to be sustainable if we're simply, creating a technically isolated pods that aren't allowing us to be interacting and be vital within the public spaces of cities. So I think there's a great opportunity ahead, and I wonder how the listeners might think of themselves as being involved in that, in creating a sort of more natural age of cities, age of human capital, as Jane Jacobs referred to it in the last book she was working on, that might be connecting to some of our ancient roots in some ways, and connecting to what is the greatest characteristics of cities and of public spaces.
Very good question. Again, thank you so much, Michael, for giving your time to this podcast.
I do. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. You learned something new and also got inspired by the guest. Don't forget to share the episode on your social media and recommend it to people you think they are really interested in this topic. Thank you so much again for giving your valuable time to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.